What's up guys, my name is Ace, and welcome back to the Versus series. This is the series where I take two elements from a Call of Duty game that are somewhat similar, and I break down and compare their stats to find out which one is best. In today's episode, we're going to be looking at the Lewis versus the MG81. So these two LMGs are very similar. It was pretty clear that the MG81 was based off of the Lewis when it comes to the stats when they added it into the game, and then they just changed up a few of those stats. So let's have a look at the differences here. First up, damage. The Lewis has a damage profile of 40-30, and the MG81 has a damage profile of 35-22. This means they're going to take exactly the same number of shots to kill, it's just that the MG81 is dealing slightly less damage per shot, which is realistically only going to affect some very specific situations. So a very specific situation where an enemy is already hurt by an exact amount of damage that just happens to be within a threshold of like 5 damage points. Or when you're shooting through cover. This also helps a little bit when you're shooting through cover to have that slightly higher damage with the Lewis. If you're shooting through something like medium cover, you will retain a little bit more damage and you'll be able to maintain that 3-shot kill through certain amounts of cover a little bit more effectively than you would with the MG81. So the damage difference is pretty minor, but it will definitely have an effect on some very specific situations. I should also mention, just like with all the LMGs in the game, with both of these LMGs, they're essentially always going to be a 3-shot kill as long as you're not shooting through cover. And the reason for this is that drop-off point to the 4-shot kill range for both of these LMGs is so extremely far that there isn't a practical line of sight in this game even close to that range. So realistically speaking, they're always going to be a 3-shot kill. As for our rate of fire, this is where we see the first noticeable difference between the two. The Lewis has a rate of fire of 517 rounds per minute, whereas the MG81 has a rate of fire of 491 rounds per minute. So clearly, the Lewis does have the edge in this area. This also means, since it takes the same number of shots to kill and the Lewis fires faster, the Lewis is going to have the leg up when it comes to time to kill. Our statistical minimum time to kill in the 3-shot kill range, which is the only range that matters for the Lewis, is 232 milliseconds, and for the MG81, it's 244 milliseconds. Assuming every single one of your shots hit, this is a very minor difference between the two. We're looking at a frame or less of difference between the two. However, most gunfights don't tend to go this way. You tend to miss a few shots, and as soon as you start missing a couple shots here and there, this is where that difference in time to kill will start to become a lot more noticeable. So when it comes to time to kill, they have a very similar potential time to kill, but the Lewis is technically faster and also a bit more forgiving than the MG81. Moving on to some handling stats here, our aim down sight time with the Lewis is 300 milliseconds, and the hard-coded value for the aim down sight time with the MG81 is 290 milliseconds. However, when you hand test this, they always aim down sight on the exact same frame. So that 10 millisecond difference means absolutely nothing when you're actually looking at it in-game. As for the sprint out time, it's a little bit strange here. I'm not too sure why it is like this, but the Lewis has a sprint out time of 300 milliseconds, and the MG81 is a little bit slower at 330 milliseconds. Unlike that 10 millisecond difference in our aim down sight time, which is less than a frame, so therefore we don't actually see a difference, this 30 millisecond difference you can actually see in game, and this does make a slight difference. So the MG81 does take longer to sprint out than the Lewis. As for magazine capacity, we finally see the MG81 gaining the edge over the Lewis when we're not running extended mags. The Lewis without extended mags gives you 47 rounds in a magazine, whereas the MG81 without extended mags gives you a 60-round magazine. So definitely a noticeable difference here, and the MG81 clearly comes out on top. However, when you put extended mags on both of these LMGs, the tables turn. The Lewis with extended mags has a 97-round magazine, whereas the MG81 only has a 90-round magazine with extended mags. So if you're the type to normally run extended mags on the LMGs like I do, because I hate waiting for those reloads, then the Lewis is actually superior compared to the MG81. However, it could be argued that extended mags isn't nearly as necessary on the MG81 because it has a great standard magazine capacity at 60 rounds. As for our reload add time, this is another area where the MG81 does come out on top over the Lewis. Both of them are still pretty slow because they're LMGs, but the Lewis takes 5.19 seconds to reload, whereas the MG81 takes 4.52 seconds to reload. So even though they're both slow, it's a very noticeable difference between the two. As for hipfire, if you're just standing still, they have exactly the same hipfire spread, but when you're moving, the MG81 does have a tighter hipfire spread than the Lewis. So this is just another one of those areas where the MG81 gains a slight edge over the Lewis. And this brings us to the final stat we're going to be comparing today, because every other stat is either identical or it's just super insignificant and doesn't really affect how these guns perform. But this last stat we're going to be looking at is recoil. Now, looking at the coded values when it comes to recoil, so our gun kick as well as our view kick, these guns are basically identical in every single way. However, let's still have a look at them side by side here when it comes to recoil. And as you can see, it does appear that the MG81 has slightly less recoil. This is likely just due to the fact that it has a slightly slower rate of fire, so it's able to recenter between shots a little bit more effectively. But both of these LMGs are quite accurate for the most part. They bounce just barely side to side a little bit, and they've got a small amount of vertical recoil, but generally it's pretty contained, and you can pick people off across the map with both of these LMGs, usually with no issue. And with that, that wraps it up for all of the stats that, like I said, are significant and also different between these two guns. Personally, I stand by what I said when the MG81 first came out. I strongly feel it's a slightly inferior version of the Lewis. That's not to say that it's a terrible gun, that's not to say that it's even a bad gun. I still think the MG81 is a good LMG. However, the Lewis beats it in just about every way, especially if you're like me and you like running extended mags on all of your LMGs anyways. At that point, the only real reason for me at least to run the MG81 over the Lewis would be for that slightly faster reload time, which just isn't enough to make up for all of the other areas where the Lewis comes out ahead. But of course, that's just my opinion based on these statistics and based on my playtime with these two weapons. I'd like to know in the comment section below, which one do you prefer? Which one do you think is better? Is it the Lewis or the MG81? Also, I'd love to know in the comment section below, what would you like to see for a future episode of this series? What two elements, they can be either guns or pieces of equipment or something along those lines, which elements would you like me to compare for this series? Keep in mind though, I have been getting a few strange requests for this series where people want me to compare things that are really nothing alike. Even if they're within the same category, like two rifles for instance, it doesn't really make sense to be comparing something like an M1 Garand with an M1941 Johnson. They're just two inherently very different weapons, and they're used for different playstyles and different roles, so they're not really comparable to each other. So try to choose things that are at least somewhat comparable, have a lot of similarities, but you want to know which one is better for what kind of situations, or which one is just in general better than the other. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.